For most of the past few years, Trump and Putin have been remarkably chummy. In his first term, Trump described Putin as very smart, and originally even praised Putin's invasion of Ukraine as genius and savvy. This bromance continued into his second term, with Trump pouring praise on the Russian president, while attacking Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky as an unelected dictator. However, in recent weeks, it looks like Trump has finally soured on Putin. So in this video, we're going to explain how and why the bromance soured, and what might happen next. Dive deeper into politics with our magazine Too Long. Yep, we make a real physical magazine. In the latest issue, we discuss if Europe can really defend itself, why people like Putin get away with it, and whether we're observing the end of the American order. Find out more by clicking the link in the description. So, let's start with a quick recap. During last year's campaign, Trump made it abundantly clear that he wanted to negotiate a quick peace deal with Ukraine, both because he didn't think supporting Ukraine was good value for money, and because one of the fundamental axioms of his America First policy was extricating the US from its foreign entanglements. Now, Trump was able to force Ukraine to the negotiating table pretty quickly. While Zelensky originally resisted calls for a ceasefire, in early March, the US withdrew all military aid and intelligence sharing after the infamous public spat in the Oval Office, and Zelensky almost immediately U-turned, saying that he would accept a temporary ceasefire if Russia agreed. Now, in some sense, getting Ukraine to the negotiating table was the easy bit. After all, the Ukrainian army still relies heavily on US military support, which gives the US immense leverage. Conversely, however, the US doesn't really have much leverage over Russia. After all, it's already imposed an unprecedented sanctions regime on the Russian economy, which doesn't seem to have deterred the Kremlin, and there's no obvious way that the US could ramp up its military support for Ukraine in a way that would be dramatic enough to spook Russia into concessions. The fact that the US had obvious leverage over Ukraine, but no obvious leverage over Russia, meant that the big question was always how Trump planned on pushing Russia into negotiations. Originally, Trump's plan seemed to be to offer Russia as many concessions as possible. Trump and his defense secretary Pete Hegseth immediately signaled that they didn't expect Ukraine to retake all of its pre-2014 territory, or even pre-2022 territory, and they also didn't think that Ukraine would join NATO. Nonetheless, this wasn't enough for Putin, who essentially refused any meaningful ceasefire. Trump then offered up further concessions with his new 7-point deal in April that included de facto recognition of Russia's control over Ukrainian territory in the east, de jure recognition of Crimea, withdrawal of sanctions, economic normalization between Russia and the US, Ukraine's exclusion from NATO, and a guarantee that the US wouldn't be involved in any post-war security guarantee. This still wasn't enough for Putin, who insisted on at least 3 further concessions. First, the Kremlin insisted on Ukraine's, quote, demilitarization, which seemed to imply at least drawing down Ukraine's military, and probably also replacing Zelensky's government with a more pro-Russian one. Second, the Kremlin rejected the idea of a European peacekeeping force. And third, the Kremlin said that they wanted total control of the 4 oblasts claimed in September 2022 via sham referenda. This last demand is particularly obscene, given that Ukraine still controls 1/3 of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, including the region's capitals of Zaporizhia and Kherson. After this point, negotiations began to follow a familiar pattern. Ukraine and its allies would offer a deal or a temporary ceasefire, Russian diplomats would say something like, elements of this deal need to be fine-tuned, only to reiterate their maximalist demands, at which point the negotiations would collapse and Russia would escalate its assault. Anyway, it was in late April that Trump first started souring on Putin. After an air attack in Kyiv on April 2023, Trump posted on Truth Social to warn Putin that he was not happy and pleading, Vladimir, stop. Vladimir didn't stop, and in May, after further strikes on Ukraine's population centers, Trump again took to Truth Social to claim that Putin has gone absolutely crazy and that he was, quote, playing with fire. Nonetheless, while Trump's patience with Putin might be wearing thin, his relationship with Zelensky was also still pretty tense. And in late May, he posted that the Ukrainian leader was doing his country no favors. However, in the past month or so, Trump's relationship with Putin seems to have deteriorated further, while Trump and Zelensky now appear to be on the same page. We first got a real glimpse of this at the NATO summit on June 25th, when European leaders flattered Trump by committing to his 5% spending target and calling him daddy. During the summit press conference, Trump, who previously parroted Russian talking points about NATO starting the war, complimented his NATO allies and revealed that Putin had called him to offer help to sort a deal with Iran, but that Trump instead told Putin to focus on getting a deal in Ukraine. There was then a 2-hour-long phone call between the Russian and American presidents on July 3rd, which didn't seem to go well, with Trump admitting that he didn't make any progress towards a peace deal, and that he was very unhappy with Putin. This time, the Kremlin took a firmer tone. Yuri Ushakov, a close advisor to Putin, told state media that Russia will achieve its goals and will not back down. This apparently didn't go down well with Trump, who said a couple of days later, "We get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless." Conversely, both American and Ukrainian officials said that the call between Trump and Zelensky on July 4th, a day after the call with Putin, was their best so far. And after the call, Trump announced that he'd be resuming deliveries of Patriot interceptors, which the Pentagon abruptly paused a couple of days later, nominally to protect America's dwindling stockpiles. Anyway, you get the idea. Trump is famously fickle, but it looks like he's soured on Putin. So what happens next? Well, while a withdrawal of military aid now looks unlikely, it's hard to see how America dramatically escalates its military support for Ukraine. The Pentagon's sudden pause on interceptors suggests both that the US is genuinely worried about its stockpiles, and that people like Elbridge Colby, Trump's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, who's long argued that the US should conserve its stockpiles for a potential war with China, are exercising more influence in the DoD. Trump has instead signaled a preference for further sanctions and reportedly suggested considering a bill introduced by Lindsey Graham that would impose a 500% US tariff on imports from any country that purchases Russian uranium, gas, or oil, with carve-outs for European countries that still import Russian gas but have supported Ukraine. This bill would create a real headache for countries like China and India, who would essentially have to cut off all energy trade with Russia or face a de facto trade embargo from the US, and could put further strain on Russia's hydrocarbon-fueled economy, which is currently looking a bit shaky already. Nonetheless, history suggests that sanctions are usually less effective than the West hopes, and are unlikely to meaningfully deter the Kremlin. This is a complex and nuanced story though, and as such, there's plenty more to read about it online, with 178 sources reporting on it. The issue is, how can you be sure that what you're reading isn't totally biased? Well, that's even a problem we face when writing these videos, and luckily it's where this week's sponsor, Ground News, comes in. For this story in particular, they've identified that there's at least 30 left-leaning and 29 right-leaning sources reporting on it. In fact, in addition to this, they've also shown the main differences in headlines among left and right-leaning outlets, with left-leaning outlets focusing on Putin's brutality, and right-leaning outlets focusing on the souring of the Trump-Putin relationship. We're able to do that thanks to Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pulls back the curtain on media bias. That's because every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. But one of the best parts of the app is their blind spot feed. It presents you with stories and articles that haven't been reported on by one side of the aisle or the other, helping you better break out of your media bubble and discover what those on the other side of the political spectrum are really saying. For instance, if you lean right, you might have missed this story about Trump tacitly admitting he didn't know who ordered the Pentagon weapons cause, because just 16% of reporting comes from outlets leaning right. However, if you regularly check the blind spot feed, you get shown what you're missing, helping you keep on top of what the entire political spectrum is thinking about, and why. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Vantage plan by using the link in the description, or scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you use our link to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.